Hi, I'm Curtis Suter from Tailwind Gliders. While I was finishing up Red Merle number 8, I thought I'd show you how I take a CLM Pro pod and boom and finish it off. Well, the first thing I do is I cut the nose off. I'm showing you a caliper for a nose that I'd cut off on a previous model. I'm going to use that nice aluminum motor mount. So I'll get the nose cut off, and then while I'm at it, I cut a little bit of that tail off of the pod as well. I just think it's too long and it's not necessary. I've done that to all of them, haven't had any problems. Well, then I go over to the sander and I sand the nose and I make sure it's square. If you want any angle down in your motor, this is the time to do that. Just make sure the back of the motor then fits inside of the pod. And then I take a knife at an acute angle and I just kind of chamfer along around the inside of that nose area. And then that way the aluminum mount fits in nice and snugly, which I test fit. Just going to glue that in with JB Weld. But before you do, take some sandpaper and sand the inside of that pod first. There might be a little mold release wax on there, and you'll get a much better bond if you get rid of that wax. You can see I have my hatch there, and there's a carbon rod. And while I have the JB Weld mixed up, I'm just going to go ahead and glue that rod inside of that hatch. That's what holds my hatch on. So here's a view down through the hatch looking forward where the aluminum motor mount is, and you can see the JB Weld in there. Don't have a ton in there, not really required, but it looks really nice. And then here's my hatch. You can see I might have a little too much JB Weld on there, but it's not going to come loose. And then you can see the aluminum motor mount in there. It looks very nice. Well, for this one, instead of mounting the servos in the vertical tail as I have done in the past, I had to mount them right under the pylon, and that was for weight and balance issues. I didn't want to add any weight. You can move the wing forward and aft on the pylon, but I couldn't move it far enough forward where I wanted it, so I was just a little tail heavy, and so this time I put the servos up under the pylon. So I cut a hole large enough that I can get a plywood servo tray in there. You can see I have some JB Weld. There's another view of that. So then, before I mount the wing, I need to figure out where I want the wing to be mounted. So I have a very nifty little plywood 2-scale balance set up. Just 2 little scales, a little piece of plywood and a couple dowels I threw together. And you can put the fuselage on there. That fuselage is not touching the bench or anything. It's just sitting on that mount. Then the wing will go on those 2 dowels. And on the forward part of the mount, the leading edge of the wing will butt up against that. You just take that weight on the front scale, the weight on the back scale, and then the distance between the 2 vertical pieces that are sitting on the scales. I have the tails on the airplane. I have the boom in. I have all the radio gear up in the nose, the motors mounted, the prop, spinners, everything just like it's going to fly. But now I can just move that fuselage forward and back until I get it to balance where I think I want to balance this model. I use sailplane calc to determine that, and I use a 2% static margin to start off with. This gets me very, very close, and normally close enough I can just move the battery, and I'm perfectly balanced, and I don't have to add any weight to the nose or the tail. So then I just go over to the drill press, drill 2 holes in it. I make up some blind nuts. I don't actually use blind nuts. They don't work quite as well. They're not real smooth on inserting the bolts. So I just use actually some 8/32 nuts. I take a plywood piece that's probably a 1/4 inch thick, and I just route that down a little bit so those nuts are actually flush. And these will go up inside. That way it jams between the pylon and between this plywood plate so the nut can't pop out. And then once I know where I want them to go, I take just 2 pieces of scrap plywood and I run the bolts through there with some epoxy and epoxy those nuts in. Then once that's done, I mount the wing, make sure it works smoothly. Once it does, then I take a little micro balloons and mix that up. Make sure you put a little wax paper on the bottom of your wing. I mount the wing down, and that gives me a nice seat for my wing because this wing has dihedral and the pylon for the CLM pod is flat. For the tails, The vertical tail, I just sit right on top of the boom. I sand it a little bit because there might be some mold release there. Take a little fiberglass from about 1 inch up the vertical, go around the boom and up 1 inch the other side. So now my vertical's mounted. You can see I have a push rod that comes out the side there. It's not attached there. And then the pylon for the horizontal tail, that's for a Maxa. Worked very nicely. That's a very nice little pylon. You can see I have my push rods that go up to the servo, so I can test fit all this. I can put that boom in there, hook up the rods, and make sure all my surfaces are moving freely and they're very stiff. I have no slop in the carbon rods. So once that's done, now I can mount the boom to the pylon. But what I do is I mount the wing, just the center panel, make sure it's nice and tight, have all the tails assembled. I mix up some epoxy, slide that whole boom on, make sure you get your push rods on top of the servo tray, sight from the leading edge of the wing down to the tail, and you can twist that boom on there until that horizontal tail is perfectly aligned horizontally with the main wing. Let it sit aside and let that glue cure. And that is all there is to do for a CLM Pro pod and boom.